Rome sent its greatest army to stop a wandering nation at the Rhone. But before the enemy struck, pride had already split Rome in two.
October 6th, 105 BC, the banks of the Rhone River. On that single day, the Roman Republic suffered the absolute worst military catastrophe in its entire history. 80,000 Roman legionaries, grown men, professional soldiers, wiped off the face of the earth in a matter of hours. Along with them, 40,000 servants, camp followers, and teenagers. An entire double army, annihilated so completely that the men pinned against the deep water couldn't even run. By the raw numbers, it was a slaughterhouse that made the legendary disaster at Cannae look like a minor skirmish. Yet, the men who did this were not an organized empire. They were not a rival superpower like Carthage. They were migrating tribes from the frozen, jagged edge of the known world. The Cimbri and the Teutones, warriors who marched into the meat grinder, stripped half naked. Men who treated iron armor with absolute scorn. They fought with a primal, howling fury that literally froze Roman blood in its veins. And when the butchery was finished, they didn't even keep the loot. They destroyed every single piece of it. This was the Battle of Arausio. It should be etched into the mind of every human being who studies the ancient world. Instead, it has been completely erased from our collective memory. Burying the day Rome almost died was an intentional act. To understand the sheer weight of the bodies on that riverbank, you have to look at the psychological terror creeping down from the north. The enemy at Arausio wasn't a standard military force. It was a displaced nation. Around 113 BC, a massive climate shift, likely catastrophic coastal flooding or sudden famine, forced these tribes out of the Jutland Peninsula. Modern Denmark. They didn't leave as a raiding party. They moved as an entire civilization, hundreds of thousands of people, women giving birth on wooden wagons, toddlers walking alongside lean cattle, old men dying in the dirt, an entire culture wandering blindly across Europe, looking for a single patch of soil where their children wouldn't starve. To the highly structured, dark-haired Mediterranean world, these people looked like literal monsters out of a fairy tale. They were giants, fair-haired, pale-skinned, towering over the average Roman soldier. Before a clash, they formed a massive wall of flesh and roared. A rhythmic, booming vibration of shields and vocal cords that rattled the teeth of the men facing them. Roman historians wrote with visible horror about how these northern warriors would throw away their shields, how they fought naked in the freezing rain, driven by a strange alien contempt for death. The women fought too. They stood on the line of supply wagons, hacking down anyone who tried to retreat. For these tribes, dying in the mud wasn't a tragedy. It was the ultimate glory. And this massive, desperate human tide was rolling toward the Roman frontier. Inevitably, slowly. Rome already knew what happened when they touched this tide. They had sent a consul to the Alps in 113 BC, crushed. They sent another army in 109 BC, broken. In 107 BC, yet another Roman force was ambushed, their supreme commander killed, and the survivors forced to march under a wooden yoke of humiliation. The Senate was panicking. The rising power of the Mediterranean, the city that had burned Carthage to ash and humbled the kings of Greece, could not stop a wandering mass of homeless tribes. By 105 BC, Rome realized this wasn't a border dispute. It was an existential threat to their survival. They responded by raising the largest single military force they had ever put into the field. 80,000 heavily armored legionaries, plus tens of thousands of auxiliary troops. A massive, expensive machine of war sent directly to the Rhone Valley in southern Gaul. The goal was simple: destroy the tribes before they could climb over the Alps and look down onto the green fields of Italy. On paper, this army was invincible. It was a steel wall, and it was about to be completely liquidated, not by the axes of the northern giants, but by a slow toxic poison bubbling inside the Roman command structure. Rome committed the exact same fatal blunder that has ruined great empires since the dawn of civilization. They gave this massive force to leaders who absolutely despised each other. The first was Quintus Servilius Caepio, a proconsul, an aristocrat of the highest, purest blue blood, arrogant, haughty, completely convinced that his family lineage made him a military genius. The second commander was Gnaeus Mallius Maximus. He was the consul, the senior magistrate, by law, the supreme commander of the entire expedition. But Mallius had an unforgivable flaw in the eyes of the aristocracy. He was a novus homo, a new man, the very first person in his family to ever hold high office. He hadn't inherited his power. He had earned it through decades of sweat, blood, and competence. To Caepio, the high-born patrician, taking orders from a social inferior was a fate worse than death. It didn't matter what the law said. It didn't matter what the Senate ordered. Caepio simply refused to cooperate. He refused to merge his legionaries with Mallius's men. He refused to share intelligence. When explicitly ordered to combine camps to form a unified front against a massive enemy, Caepio pitched his tents on the opposite side of the river, separated, isolated, treating the legal commander-in-chief with public, venomous contempt. The largest army Rome had built in a generation was cracked cleanly in half by the fragile ego of one wealthy man. That single detail is the entire story of the disaster. The two Roman camps sat near the town of Arausio, modern-day Orange, France. They spent more time glaring at each other across the water than watching the horizon. Meanwhile, the Cimbri and Teutones were massing right in front of them. The tribal chiefs weren't stupid. They looked at the split Roman camps and immediately saw the vulnerability. At first, the tribal elders tried to negotiate. They didn't want a bloodbath. They wanted land to grow crops. They sent formal envoys to the tent of Mallius, the legal consul. When Caepio found out that the barbarians were talking to his rival instead of him, he lost his mind. The thought of the new man getting credit for a peaceful settlement was intolerable. He couldn't let Mallius win the glory. So, Caepio made a reckless, desperate gamble. He ordered his isolated army to pack up, cross the river, and launch a sudden independent strike. No coordination, no backup plan, just pure, unadulterated spite. It took the tribes less than an hour to completely overrun his position. Caepio's lines collapsed instantly under the weight of the northern charge. His camp was plundered. His men were cut down while trying to flee back toward the river. And because Mallius's army was entirely separate, they could only watch the smoke rise from the hills. But the horror was only halfway done. Flushed with blood and adrenaline, the tribes turned their entire focus toward Mallius's remaining legions. And here is where the physical geography became a literal execution chamber. The Roman commanders had positioned their backs directly against the wide, deep, rushing waters of the Rhone River. When the tribal wall hit them, the Roman lines bent, buckled, and snapped. The legionaries tried to employ their famous tactical retreat, but there was nowhere to go. They fell backward into the water. Men weighed down by 40 pounds of heavy iron armor sank like rocks into the mud of the Rhone. Those who stayed on the bank were pinned against the current and butchered where they stood. No escape routes, no secondary lines, no mercy. The ancient accounts written by the Romans themselves state that 80,000 soldiers died that afternoon, plus 40,000 civilians. 120,000 human lives ended before the sun went down. Modern historians argue over the exact numbers, but the scale of the trauma is undeniable. It was a complete structural collapse. Two entire armies ceased to exist. Then came the detail that truly broke the collective psyche of Rome, the part that transformed a military loss into a deep, generational nightmare. After the slaughter, the Cimbri and Teutones didn't collect the spoils. They didn't gather the gold coins from the pockets of the dead. They didn't strap the high-quality Roman swords to their own hips. Instead, they gathered every single piece of metal, fabric, and flesh and offered it as a massive sacrifice to their gods. They smashed the iron breastplates with heavy stones. They threw thousands of gold and silver coins directly into the river. They systematically broke the legs of the captured Roman horses and pushed them into the deep current to drown. And the human prisoners? The surviving Roman soldiers? They hanged them, thousands of them, suspended from the branches of the trees lining the Rhone, swinging gently in the autumn wind. An entire landscape of wealth, completely destroyed and discarded. To the Romans, this was terrifyingly alien. You could not bribe an enemy like this. You could not negotiate with people who looked at a fortune in gold and threw it into the mud for the spirits of the north. When the news hit the streets of Rome, the city fell into a deep, paralyzing state of panic. They called it the Terror Cimbricus, the Cimbrian Terror. The state passed emergency laws. They banned any military-aged man from leaving Italy. They expected the giants to pour over the Alps at any moment and burn the city to the ground. The public rage against the man who caused this was white hot. Quintus Servilius Capio was brought home in chains. The Senate stripped him of his command, an act almost unprecedented in Roman history. They confiscated his property. They revoked his citizenship and cast him into permanent exile. There was a rumor that Capio had previously stolen a massive hoard of sacred gold from a temple in Tolosa. The people whispered that the slaughter at Arausio was the heavy hand of the gods punishing Rome for his sacrilege. To this day, historians track the gold of Tolosa as one of the great cursed treasures of the ancient world. But this disaster did something else. It forced Rome to change or die. In their utter desperation, the people turned to a man they usually ignored, Gaius Marius, another lowborn general. Marius used the absolute terror of the moment to completely dismantle and rebuild the Roman military from scratch. He threw out the old rules. Before Arausio, you had to own land to serve in the army. Marius opened the ranks to the poor, the homeless, the desperate men living on the streets of Rome. The state paid for their weapons. He turned the army into a permanent, professional career. He made them carry their own rations, earning them the nickname Marius's Mules. This newly forged machine marched north a few years later and completely wiped out the Cimbri and Teutones. The threat was neutralized. Italy was saved. And that exact salvation is why Arausio was swept under the rug. History isn't just written by the winners, it's edited by them. Rome chose to remember the glorious comeback. They chose to celebrate the brilliance of Marius and the birth of the invincible imperial legions. The 80,000 men rotting on the banks of the Rhone became a painful footnote, a temporary embarrassment before the inevitable triumph. But we need to look at Arausio, not because of the body count, but because it was completely preventable. The northern tribes didn't outsmart Rome. Rome committed suicide. A massive, well-trained army was turned into bird food because an aristocrat's pride wouldn't let him stand next to a man of lower birth. The most dangerous thing on that riverbank wasn't the giant with the iron axe. It was the fragile ego of a man who thought his bloodline made him better than the law. And there is a deep, bitter irony waiting at the end of this story. The professional army Marius created to save Rome from the tribes, an army made of poor men who were loyal only to the general who paid them, would eventually turn around and destroy the Roman Republic itself. Those professional legions became the personal tools that men like Sulla, and later Julius Caesar, used to cross the Rubicon and seize total power. The survival mechanism born from the blood of Arausio ultimately gave birth to the emperors. The next time you look at a coin with Caesar's face on it, or run your fingers along the stone of an ancient Roman wall, remember how that entire empire started. It started with a lesson paid for in blood on a riverbank. A lesson about what happens when pride divides the men who are supposed to stand together.